Welcome everyone. Today we're here at the Western Institute for Social Research in Berkeley, California. I'm the president and one of the faculty members, and we're here with Jake Sloan, who has long been associated with WISER, that's our acronym. And Jake, I'm pleased that we're going to be able to talk about your recent book today.
John, I'm very pleased to be here.
Jake Sloan's recent book, Standing Tall, Willie Long and the Mare Island Original 21ers, like many stories of significant social change, is one that's been mostly off the radar for the last half century, since the story first unfolded in the early 1960s. It is a story of skilled working-class African Americans who were taken for granted by the U.S. Navy for whom they work, and they were discriminated against, routinely and shamefully exploited. Yet, they were instrumental in performing the expert duties necessary to build and keep U.S. submarines and ships safe and in working order. They took great risks to their continued employment and livelihood in filing a discrimination complaint against the Navy. And after several years, their efforts began to make meaningful social change in the shipyard and beyond. However, this story and the impact of the efforts and risks that the 29ers took did not make news headlines. Indeed, it is often the case that the most significant social change efforts are discussed neither by the mass media nor in history textbooks. As a result, we are deprived of the inspiration and instruction that can be found from such stories. Whether we're elders, youth, or people in our prime adult years, we can learn much in terms of how to follow the paths created by those unsung heroes. Thankfully, Jake's told this story, and today we have an opportunity to hear from him about the story, both to honor the men who risked so much in order to benefit others, and to think about the lessons that we can get and apply them to today's challenges. Despite the civil rights movement and the successful efforts of the invisible people like these unsung heroes, the 21ers, inequality today in our society is increasing, as are racial injustices. And they continue to be fueled by ugly, albeit powerful forces in our society. In today's interview, Jake's going to discuss his book, what he did to write the book, and some of the main storylines found in the book, and how we can learn from that struggle that began over 50 years ago, and from that, how we can fashion successful strategies to do something about the significant and even deepening inequities that remain today. Jake, could you begin by telling us a bit about what you did to write the book? And I know it went back many years ago, and then bring us up to the actual recent publication of the book.
Thank you, John. To understand what we were up against at the time, in 1960, there were more than 1,000 African Americans working at Mare Island Naval Shipyard in Vallejo. Of those, we can only ascertain that there were 2 who were supervisors out of more than 1,000. And they were in the shops that were focused mainly on non-skilled labor. And so over time, there became great dissatisfaction with that reality. You have to understand also that we were not only facing a challenge in being promoted to supervisor, we were facing a challenge in being paid unequally for the same work that whites did. Further, you have to understand that we had ingrained thought there at the time, or ingrained acceptance of the idea of tiered pay and unfairness in promotions, because many of the workers on the shipyard, both white and black, came from the South. And in fact, we had as much and sometimes more resistance from African Americans about what we were trying to do in protesting this as we did from whites. But gradually, dissatisfaction grew, and a group of people led by Willie Long decided to file a complaint with the federal government against this widespread discrimination. This story unfolded over a number of years, and it was largely untold, because at the time that we started, secrecy was of more importance than keeping notes or worrying about history. We didn't have our minds on history at all. What we had our minds on was being treated fairly by the system that we were working in. And so, led by Willie Long, we decided to file a complaint against the federal government, and we had the opportunity because President Kennedy had put in place an executive order that disallowed this kind of discrimination in hiring, promotions, and pay in the federal governmental system. And so we organized, led by Willie Long, over a period of time beginning in late 1960 and culminating in 1961 to get as many African Americans as we could to file a complaint. Of the 1,000 workers working there, more than 1,000, we were only able to get 25 to file that complaint. And all this had to be done in secrecy. Over the years after that, we didn't discuss what we were doing with many people. In fact, most of our families had no awareness of what we were doing. So the story was lost really in the beginning because we weren't trained to keep notes and document things for history. It just wasn't on our mind. So a lot of it was lost over time. Even when the shipyard closed in 1996, there was no real recognition. There was a book published at that time about the history of the Mare Island, and there was no mention of what we call the original 21ers or the leaders in that great effort. And so it went untold for years after that. Only in 2005, after one of the group mentioned it in passing to his nephew, did the story become known. Because at that time, the nephew realized the importance and put us in touch with the Vallejo Times-Herald. A writer there did a series of articles on the original 21ers. The story became known, and ultimately we were recognized in the congressional record. So that was the brief history of it.
Well, that's good, Jake. That's very helpful. There is, I know, some history to your doing research on this. Like you said, there weren't notes taken originally. A lot of your book is, of course, based on your recollections. However, I know that you also did do follow-up interviews with some of the surviving members of the group. Could you tell us a little bit about when you first started to do further conversations that you took notes on with some of the surviving participants and how that process went up to the publication of the book?
For many reasons, I left the shipyard after working there for about 5 years. I had been a high school dropout, didn't complete my education, and I decided at the urging of some of the 21ers to return to school and get an education. So I went to San Francisco. Well, originally I went to community college and then on to San Francisco State to study history. As I was studying history, I realized that what we did had historical importance, and I thought that I should document it at least for the families involved. Mm-hmm. So in, believe it or not, so long ago, in 1980, I went and I found Willie Long, who was the leader, and interviewed him with the idea that I would write the story. For many reasons over the years, I dropped it, but in about 15 years ago, I decided that the story was really important, and I went back to researching for it. And the research began with this. At the time that I made the decision that the story should be told, there were only 8 left of the original 25. I interviewed them first, individually and as a group, because I knew that as individuals, they would have a different memory of it than they would as a group. And then I interviewed the family members, those who really knew anything about it, in particular Willie Long's wife. I interviewed her and others who remembered the story at all. And I interviewed others who worked at the shipyard, both African American and white, who had memories of the incident. I went so far as to go to the University of Michigan to do some research on a tip that I had gotten. But just over the years, I did it mainly on research, talking with the surviving members, talking with their families. I read probably 40 books on history, political science, autobiography, and biography from the period so that I could gather the materials to write the story. But mainly it was interviews, because you have to understand that I was not a leader in the group in any way. So many of the things that took place I really knew nothing about. I was a foot soldier and a very young one. So the leaders in the group, some of them were 20 years older than I was. So I wasn't in their day-to-day discussions, to be quite honest with you. So I had to recreate based on what I learned from them. Unfortunately, by that time, 40 years after the event, many of them had very dim memories about what exactly had happened, and they had no notes. The one who would have taken the best notes was Willie Long, and he had been long dead when I became serious about the story. But that's basically how I rebuilt the story.
So Jake, I appreciate you giving us some of the background of the research. I want to say that as somebody who takes good research seriously, you have a lot of meticulous detail in your book, and it's very, very valuable, partly because of the enormous detail of sharing the experiences of the 21ers. Vera Laba's here with us today. Vera is one of our key staff and faculty members since 1980. And Vera, I know you've read Jake's book and you have thoughts about it, and I'm glad that you can discuss with Jake his book today.
Thanks, John. I'm really happy to be here today, and I think Jake's book is a very important book to have. I do have a question, Jake, that I'd like to ask. I'm wondering, what do you think are the most important lessons to be learned by today's leaders of the efforts of the 21ers?
That's a good question, Vera. The title of the book says a lot about what I believe was important then, and that is standing tall. You remember that I talked about the need for secrecy. The need for secrecy was great because there had been dissatisfaction, unhappiness with the situation at Mare Island for many years, probably going back 20 years. But people were afraid to stand up for a couple of reasons. One was there had been people who stood up individually or as small groups before, and when what they were doing was discovered, they were fired summarily. And we knew that if what we were doing was discovered, we would be fired summarily. We didn't think it, we knew it. And so there was reluctance for people to stand up, again, because not only was there opposition from the leadership in Mare Island, there was opposition from the African Americans who thought of this as being what it was, a good job, relatively speaking, at the time, and they didn't want to risk losing it. Someone had to stand up and take the risk of being fired, and that was Willie Long, who was our leader. After many years of seeing what had happened to himself and to others, he decided to stand up and lead an effort to organize against the systematic discrimination at Mare Island. That is the primary thing that I learned, and the other is the need for people to be aware of what's going on. There were people who were being discriminated against who really weren't aware of it, the level of discrimination because of past practices. So those would have been the things that the most important about what I learned, the need for courage to stand up to things that are wrong. So among other things, what I learned, the most important thing I learned was the need for people to stand up for what they believe in and not be afraid of the consequences. You have to be smart and do it at a level of secrecy, but the need to stand up and then to work together. There were many men on the shipyard who were completely dissatisfied and had filed complaints before, but been just rejected or fired. With a group, you stand much more of a chance, so people need to stand up and work together.
Thank you, Jake. I have a follow-up question, and I want to talk a little bit about what was the sort of moral path that you think that the men had. You mentioned in your book, statedly mentioned in the book, that Willie Long and John Edmondson were men of faith. And in a commentary yesterday, I heard a newsman speak of John McCain as people of faith, men of faith can take risk. And I'm just interested in knowing if you felt that because Willie Long and John Edmondson were men of faith, it gave them courage to be committed and sustain their activity at all risk.
I'm not sure about that. As I said before, I was one of the younger members of the group, and I didn't have a lot of conversation with the leadership because they were much older than I was. I do know this, with the exception of 3 or 4 of us, all the men were religious. They believed they were Christians, all of them. They were also, some of them were also Masons. And so they had a belief system that I think stood them in good stead. But I want to say that the most important thing they had was belief in themselves and courage. We have to remember, though, that at that time, contrary to what's happening now, religion played a great role in black society. Almost everyone was associated with the church in one way or the other. So I'm sure that that helped to drive them, and also the leadership of the civil rights movement at the time was largely made up of ministers and people who were of the faith. So I'm sure it had tremendous influence. Both of them were dedicated members of their churches. I say both, was John Edmondson and Willie Long, who I think are the real heroes of this, were active in their churches. Willie even sang in the choir. So I'm sure that had an influence.
So Jake, I'd like you to explore with us further the connections between way back in the early 60s and today's circumstances. And I'd be especially interested in having you tell us what you consider to be some of the similarities and some of the differences then and now, both in terms of the problems that existed then as compared to the problems today, as well as the strategies and approaches to the problems then as compared to what you think might be the best strategies and approaches today.
One of the problems that we had, in addition to the fact that we couldn't be promoted or weren't allowed to be promoted to supervisor, was the fact that we were paid less for doing the same work as non-African Americans were paid. In other words, the way the shipyard was organized is when you started working there, if you were in the production shops, you started as either a helper or an apprentice. If you became an apprentice, after 4 years, you automatically became a journey person. If you started as a helper, the next step was a limited journey person, and then you became a journey person. There were people there who had worked for 15 years and were still helpers, but they were doing the same work as journey people, being paid as helpers. So just to use a number, you could be doing the same work as a non-African American and be paid $2 an hour for work that they were being paid $3 an hour for. And so that was a form of income inequality that was set in place. We still have the same challenge now, income inequality, for different reasons, but it's a great challenge. And the net result is, over time, you see what we have now is wealth inequality, which is probably more important in the long run. So that was a challenge that we had then and we have now.
Could you say more about that? You just said the wealth income inequality today is probably even more important, and expand on that if you would.
Well, if you were being paid substantially more at the time, you had a chance, more of a chance, other problems notwithstanding, of buying a home and building equity, which is one of the real foundations in this society for building wealth. So all the people who didn't have enough money at the time or make enough money to buy a house weren't able to start the process of building wealth. And that's reflected in the world that we live in today.
But if I heard you correctly, you're suggesting that it's even accentuated today, or did you not? I want to make sure that I and others listening.
I think now there are more reasons for the income inequality. One is simply the inability of young people to get jobs, to start to make any salary.
Yeah, okay.
But I think that's the continuing problem is the inability to build wealth.
What about the strategies for addressing the problems, comparing then and now? What similarities and differences do you think are worth highlighting?
I frankly am not certain. I thought at the time that over time with the civil rights movement that came about, and then affirmative action, that we would have solved a great deal of this problem. Now it hasn't happened, and quite frankly, I don't know the answer. I do know that, especially given the current political situation, the resolution of the problem rests with African Americans. We can't depend on other people to resolve it.
So Jake, I understand that the problems that we have to address today are really, really difficult and there's no easy answers. but I'd like you to say more about some of the things that I've heard you say in the past about the details of at least possible strategies. Could you expand?
Yes, I can. We believe that what we did was a partial reason for the civil rights movement. We believe that because of the interaction we had with the President's Committee on Equal Employment Opportunity, that we influenced the civil rights movement. And the civil rights movement benefited many, including yours truly, Jake Sloan. The era of affirmative action benefited many. Too many have forgotten that they made great progress on the shoulders of others, have forgotten that. And what I say now is we need an elite that's not elitist. The people who have benefited from the civil rights movement and the era of affirmative action need to stand up, take a leadership role as Willie Long did, and work to help our people to rise up.
Jake, you were very young when you got involved with the 21ers. I'm very interested in knowing what were some of your social consciousness and awareness that you chose at that young age to get involved with older men in this effort?
That's a question that has many answers, but I'll give it my best shot. I did join the Army at a very young age. I joined the Army when I was 15, basically to get away from the neighborhood that I was in. And I stayed in the Army for more than 3 years. So when I came from the Army, I was 19. What I saw in the Army was that although the Army was integrated at that time, it was segregated within itself. And that is that almost all the black soldiers were in service divisions of the Army, the quartermaster, trucking, service outfits, none of the really technical. So that concerned me. And then I was in the Army for more than 3 years, and I only met 2 black officers of all the hundreds of thousands of people that I met in the Army. 2 black officers. One was a general that I met kind of in passing, and one was a captain in my Army, in my outfit, I'm sorry. And so that was on my mind. And then I go to Mare Island and I see that there were men there who, like John Edmondson, had worked there for 30 years and was considered to be the best pipe fitter on the yard, and he couldn't get a promotion. Willie Long had been there more than 15 years, considered to be an excellent pipe fitter, and he couldn't get a promotion. And so that bothered me, although I was never discriminated directly against at Mare Island because I hadn't been there long enough, really. That bothered me, and I wanted to do something. And Willie said something that has always stuck with me, and that is that if the people in the South, and this is at the height of the Civil Rights movement, if the people in the South can risk their lives for what they believe in, we can risk these little jobs. So I took that. And also, although I had been trained to kill in the Army, I didn't have the kind of nerve that was required to go down south and get my head cracked. So I wanted to do something, and the easiest thing for me to do really was to join those guys. And I want to say this too, I had much less to risk than they did. I was young, I was single, if everything else failed, I could have re-enlisted in the Army, and I could eat every day. There were guys like Boston Banks who were 40 years old, had 5 children, they had a lot to risk. So that was pretty easy to make that decision for me.
Thank you.
And what I would say for young people now is what's required, well, for everyone, what's required is courage and determination. Willie Long was the most courageous, determined person I've ever met, and was a great influence on us, and has influenced my life till today.
So, Jake, thanks for being with us today to talk about your book, and Vera, thank you for helping us have this discussion. I think it's been very valuable to hear, Jake, about what you did to create the book and write the book, the history of what happened way back in the early 60s, and some of the implications for today. I think it's really important that we've had this discussion about the book because the book is an important part of history, and some of the most important things in history are untold stories. And it's really, really valuable that this story gets told. There's other stories too that should be told, but this one is a very important one. And it's also important that we take to heart what we can learn from the story, because as we've discussed today, the inequalities and racial injustices today are even worse than they were, despite the progress that's been made. So I think having the opportunity for us to read your book, to discuss it, to learn from it's really valuable. I'm really glad that here at Weiser, where we try to promote this kind of action-oriented scholarship, that we've been able to be here today to have this conversation, and I'd like to hear what you would like to say by way of some closing remarks.
Thank you, John. My closing remark is this. An awful lot has been written about the civil rights movement in the South. Not nearly as much or enough about the civil rights movement on the West Coast. Mm-hmm. And in particular, that is the case about the civil rights movement. I don't know if that's what I should call it, but the challenges that African Americans had in the building trades, both in the private sector and the governmental sector, with rampant discrimination. In the beginning, I wanted to tell the story for the benefit of the families especially, but I also wanted the general public to know the story. In the end, what drove me was an old African proverb that when an elder dies, a library is burned. I didn't want my library to be burned when I die, especially a part of it, the part about the 21ers. I wanted the story of the 21ers to be told forever. It's a great story that ought to be told.
Jake, in listening to you today, I'm reminded of a quote that you used by Paulo Freire in your book, where he said that freedom is acquired by conquest, not by gift, and that it must be pursued constantly and responsibly. And I think your book illustrates that fact, that the men, Willie Long and John Edmondson, really pursued constantly, and they were responsible. They didn't, even though they were taking risk, they were leaders of the men, like the young man that you were, and the other men. They took responsibility for leading it in such a way that it didn't endanger you. And I think that's a very important lesson, I think, for young people and people involved in the struggles today. That they want freedom, it has to be constant, and it has to be responsible, and it has to be, it's not going to happen overnight. It's a process.